This is Outrageous History. Welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. When William Lyon Mackenzie King resigned as Prime Minister of Canada in November of 1948, he had held that office for nearly 22 years, surpassing even John A. Macdonald's reign of 19 years. But that may be the least notable point of King's lengthy terms of office. Instead, primarily because of the public release of his extensive diaries and correspondence, King has been labeled as an eccentric, unmarried throughout his life, carrying quite an ego, and perhaps most baffling of all, a devoted spiritualist who regularly communicated with his deceased mother and many others, including former U.S. President Roosevelt. But those stereotyped labels don't come close to fully portraying Mackenzie King. Award-winning author and historian Allan Levine's biography, King William Lyon Mackenzie King: A Life Guided by the Hand of Destiny, uses the Prime Minister's overflowing file boxes of diaries to describe the complexities of the man. And Allan has joined us today from Winnipeg. Allan, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
You know, Allan, Mackenzie King has unfortunately been labeled somewhat with an unflattering reputation, but most historians put him at the top of the list of the greatest Canadian prime ministers. Could he have been that strange and yet have had such a major influence in politics and for the country in general?
I think so. I mean, he wasn't insane. Let's start off by that. He was definitely, as you said, eccentric. I mean, let's be honest. If King, a politician like King, existed today with social media and the intrusive journalists and media and so forth, he never would have. He never would have survived. But he was born and grew up in an era when his private life was kept private. I mean, he was. First of all, no one stays prime minister for nearly 22 years without doing something right. I mean, there are factors for that, and the opposition conservatives certainly helped him by doing everything they could to make it easier for him to win most of the time during that period of time. But I don't see any Canadian prime minister ever beating him. So in terms of sheer longevity, you can't really describe the 20th century or the first part of the 20th century of Canadian history without King, because he was always there. He was very petty, insecure, selfish, egotistical, a very strange man. And yet he had some good political smarts. As you said, he never married, so he devoted every waking minute of his life to his career, and that's what pushed him on. But he was very complex. The main thing about King is, had the diary not been made public, you and I probably wouldn't be talking about him. I mean, it's that one decision. He left rather ambiguous instructions in his will. And some of his closest friends did not want the executors of his literary estate to ever publish them, or they wanted them to be vetted severely. But that proved impossible. I mean, the diary itself, and that's why I did the book, because the diary exists. I mean, without the diary, King is just not a very exciting guy. Like, no one wants to write about rail commissions and grain trade rates. I mean, he was a brilliant leader during the World War II, and he kept the country together, and he and all that. But of course, what makes him interesting is that it's rare to have, over a period of 30 years or more, the day-to-day thinking of someone, even if that thinking isn't always true or realistic. But so that gives you an insight into someone. No biographer could ask for a better thing. I mean, the diary's 30,000 pages. It's not every single day he wrote in it, and then later in his life he was actually dictating it to his secretary. But it certainly carries all of his views on people, and as I said, he was very insecure, so he recorded every insult that someone made of him. He He took things way out of proportion. At Christmas time, he would count up who sent him Christmas cards and more importantly, who didn't. And he had a long memory.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote, all the crazy stuff that we now know because they made that diary public. We know about his obsession with hands on the clock, his spiritualism, his talking to his dogs. He had 3 Irish Terriers who he all named Pat. He loved the dogs like anybody would love a child. His various machinations with women, his over-the-top love for his mother. The thing I should add also, the thing that makes the diary accessible is that the National Archives in Ottawa digitized it years ago when I first was doing writing on Canadian political. This is like the early 90s. I did a book called Scrum Wars about prime ministers in the media, and of course King was featured in that book in a chapter. And the diary was on microfiche, so you couldn't search. You have to know which date you were looking for, what you were looking for. You couldn't search it. But when they digitized it, they allowed you to not only have access to the diary, sitting in my home office here, because it's on the web, but also you could search the diary. So if you put in words like, I put in a phrase like "dear mother," and the phrase appears thousands of times in his diary, so I could track, and I was able to track his attitudes, prejudices against Black people and Jews and Asians and all that, and no one had probably done that before. Plus, I dug into he kept track of all his various craziness with the seances, and we can, if you want to talk about that a little bit more, we can, because so that makes him that made the diary I was able to use it. If I hadn't been able to do that, I never would have done the book. As it is, dealing with the diaries, I admit that I did not read every single entry, but I certainly read a lot. Once you find a subject you want to read about, it's easy to find in the diary. And then if you take the diary along, King's papers in Ottawa are massive, and they organize them in a very bizarre way afterwards. It's not all chronological. They took out reports and memorandums and put them in one file, as personal stuff in another, newspaper clippings another. So it's like I was there a long time, and I had done some work in this earlier book, so I sort of knew what was going on, and I ended up targeting. There's been lots written about King. My biography was the first attempt to make a 1-volume book that was accessible to the public in a way that American writers write about presidents in that way. More popular, I guess, but with an academic bent. And I made sure that I tried to do that. But so that's what makes him, I think, an interesting character, because he is very complicated, and he would be absolutely shocked and astounded, very aghast actually, that his diary is now accessible to the world, and you and I are talking about it and his private thoughts, and he just certainly didn't want that. I think he wanted to be remembered as a great Canadian leader, not as a crazy lunatic who was talking to dead presidents and so forth.
Well, so we have his eccentricities, but he was a highly educated man. Right. Apparently, yeah. more educated than any other prime minister. He had several master's degrees?
A couple of masters, a PhD, and Pierre Trudeau was pretty up there too. I would say that the two of them. But yeah, King was very educated. He was his parents, his mother, who was the youngest child of William Lyon Mackenzie, the rebel leader and first mayor of Toronto in the 1830s. Was the person. That's what he called himself. He was named after his grandfather, who died before he was born, and then he was. And then he changed his name later in life to William Lyon Mackenzie King, and how he signed his name. Initially, he was just Willie King when he was younger. But his parents, his father struggled. His mother was very demanding. She thought she had a bit of entitlement to her family. Had struggled financially, so King felt this great burden as the oldest son to help his parents, and then they ended up getting sick and dying, which triggered some of his in fact, it did trigger his interest in spiritualism. That was, and
it's been pointed out that, of course, that he remained unmarried throughout his
Yes.
life, but really there were a lot of women in his life, both as a young man and
Right.
even as he moved through
Oh
higher
yeah,
politics.
no, sure. He courted many women. I mean, the line is that he was always looking for his mother. And in fact, if you go to Ottawa to Laurier House, where he lived, he inherited that house from Laurier, Wilfrid Laurier. In King's library, there's a bust, a famous painting rather, of his mother, and it's still lit up the way. And the library is exactly how King had it. It's kind of eerie, the whole thing. I was actually there once for a séance. I was talked into some crazy idea by a filmmaker. It's pretty funny. The whole thing was pretty funny. But I mean, they say the psychics at the time thought they were communicating with King and his dog. I thought, I don't know. As I was sitting there, I was wondering how I had got myself into that. But no, I mean, he had many close relationships with women. He courted them. He may have had an affair when he was younger with believe it or not, with the wife of a Presbyterian priest in Toronto that he was very close to. Her name was Marjorie Heritage. The letters between them are extremely intimate. That's one thing. These people never throw anything out. So I'm not sure. Some people doubt that it was, but it was pretty intimate. And his other closest, the closest relationship with the woman he had in his life was a woman named Joan Pattison, who was married. And she was married to a banker named Godfrey, and she was actually the grandmother of John McCallum, the Liberal LP, which I tracked down. But I did talk to her. No, sorry, that would have been his great grandmother rather. But Joan and King shared an intellectual, if not more, relationship. No one really knows. There was one moment in the 1920s that something may have happened, but that was King actually cut those pages from the diary. So I'm not sure.
Unfortunate.
He was trying to hide, but Joan certainly had the most accommodating husband that I could find, because his wife was every day or night with Mackenzie King. She hosted his party. She acted he bought her gifts. He definitely was secretly, in love with her. There's no doubt in my mind, but he never, I don't know afterwards, did anything about it, but she was there, and she's very important, and she's mentioned once they meet in about just after he becomes Liberal leader in 1919. She's a key personality, and I do spend some time integrating that. I mean, I think the thing with understanding King, and as you might know, years ago, the first time the diary was made public was by Charles Stacey, C.P. Stacey, a University of Toronto historian. He wrote a book he actually got into the diary and didn't like King, had met King when he was in the army. He was an army historian during the World War II, thought King was just, not to be respected. So, I mean, he was sort of out for him in a way, I think. I met Stacey. I was a student at U of T in the late 70s and early 80s. And I remember him, and he just didn't like King. And he had wrote this book that was sensational. Even though King's diaries had already been published, excerpts have been published in newspapers already by that time, that the book itself, and he tries to make this case that, King had two separate lives, but I don't really buy that. My approach was that everything that King did on his other life impact, you can't really always tell. There's a couple of times when a psychic told him to hold an election and he did, and he lost. But then he would just rationalize it. I mean, the psychics always told him, like all psychics, what he wanted to hear. And they knew him well enough, and he was paying them. And then they were doing stuff like on Ouija boards and other crazy things. King saw images in the shaving cream lather, believe it or not. That's my favorite. And it's just some bizarre, and he'd write about it as if it was hands on the clock. If he did something and the hands were at 6 or 12, or it was like noon or midnight or something, that was significant. I'm not sure exactly why, but he believed so. So, I believe that it impacted on everything he did, but somehow no one, the other thing is, some people did know, because he wasn't quite as careful as we believe. He did invite some of his closest friends occasionally, and he did try to introduce them to what he was doing. But no one talked about it, not even journalists that I know. Years ago, I interviewed Bruce Hutchinson. I don't know if you know, he was a famous Canadian
Mm-hmm.
writer and journalist. And he was pretty old when I had met him, and then it was probably about 1990. He was already an old guy, but he swore to me that he did not know about King's private life, and I believe him. And you know, there were rumors, and as you see, you mentioned that great story about King talking to FDR, Roosevelt. You know, he was at a governor general's party or something, and he made some comment about how I just spoke to the president, and the person he was talking to, I think it was a relative actually. And I said, you mean, you know, you spoke to President Harry Truman? No, I spoke to FDR, Roosevelt. Like they sort of just shook their heads, but somehow it just didn't get out until King died. At one point, King was in England, and this was just after World War II, and he got sick. And these women, the journalists were in the hotel lobby, Canadian journalists and British. And these women kept going up to his room, and you know, they were psychics or people belonging to the spiritual society that King was involved in, and they didn't really follow it up. I mean, today's journalists certainly would have, so he would have got caught.
They would have had a drone outside the window.
Yeah, I would just add, the thing about the spiritualism, two things. One, King wasn't the only one. It's just that we know so much about him. I mean, that's the thing. Even though, I mean, it wasn't common, I would say, but it wasn't uncommon. Let's put it that way. I was criticized once for trying to suggest that everybody was a spiritualist. I never really have said that, but I just thought it was, especially during World War I, when there was so much death of young men during the First World War, people of that era in Britain and Canada and the US needed something to believe, and they wanted to believe in an afterlife. King lost, as I said, his parents, but he also lost two siblings. So between about 1916 and 1922, he had three siblings. So two of them died young from health issues, and his parents died his father got blind, glaucoma. His mother also died sick. She was after the father. So losing and they were really the most important people in his life. So when he lost those four people, his younger sister and him never quite got along as well. I think it triggered something in him, and he was always seeking comfort and looking for something in his life. And then he turned to spiritualism, like other people, and he just bought it hook, line, and sinker. Where it's crazy. I am not suggesting some of his writings. When you get into, there's actually in the archives a whole spiritual series. He kept these, some of them I was told were burned because they were really crazy, but he kept notebooks of what happened during each seance. He doesn't put that all in the diary, so you have to sort of, if you really want to go dig, I mean, it's just nuts. His birthday was always a big day because he would have this seance, or he would go to the Ouija board or something, and all these people from history, going back to Jesus, would show up to wish him a happy birthday. I mean, that's just right. It sounds nutty, but especially Laurier and his parents, and he was always, and he also was into dream analysis. His dreams are really crazy. He was always floating on clouds. He was in train stations waiting for going somewhere. He tried to get the dreams analyzed by the psychics. They weren't very. I don't think he really learned much, and so that part of him is it's fascinating. But he still managed to get on with his life, like many people. I'm sure there are other people who are spiritualists, and there were other people, famous people, writers and so forth.
Very notable people, yes.
Yeah, and there's a guy in Winnipeg, Hamilton. He was a famous psychic, took these weird pictures, and he lived a bit far from where I live, but it's called Hamilton House, and he invited all these. Arthur Conan Doyle, I think, visited Winnipeg and visited him because he was into that too. So, were these people all crazy? It's all relative, I suppose. But King, did it impede and affect his job? Yeah, maybe a little. But he still managed to do the right thing in most cases. He was governed by all sorts of other prejudices, racism and attitudes about Quebec, and he was politically opportunistic. He was his famous as prime minister. He was always waiting for the see which way the wind blew, and then he would decide, because the Conservatives always made it easy. They always committed to the most extreme position possible. Sort of what they're doing today, to be honest. Like Mackenzie King, let me tell you, would never have supported the so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa.
Right.
But the Conservatives have done exactly what Conservatives, they would have done that in the past too, maybe, or they would have taken a position. The alien in the 20s. Arthur Meehan, let's put it this way, was a brilliant man. He and King actually were students at the University of Toronto together, and he always bested King in debates at the U of T. So Meehan was a lawyer. He was sharp. He was smart. And yet Meehan was prime minister for 20 months over 30 years or 25 years. King was almost 22 years. How do you figure that, right? Because Meehan was inflexible. He believed in, he got Quebec mad for helping with conscription or the draft in World War I. He was keen on protective tariffs, or in those days, and high duties. And if Western farmers hated him for that, he supported putting down the strike in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. So the labor never forgave him for that. And King just sort of tried to play the middle of the road. And King understood more than most people and in Canada, extremism never works. And if you stuck to the middle of the political spectrum, you're going to be successful. That, and I would say the other thing about him that is probably the most important, is that he was almost guaranteed. In those days, Quebec had 65 seats. And there was no nationalist party that was on the federal scene like the Bloc Québécois today or any other party. And every single election, King started off with he beat the Conservatives after they hung Louis Riel in 1885. They were done for years in Quebec. Even in 1930, when R.V. Bennett became the Conservative Prime Minister at the onset of the Depression, King still won 40 out of 65 seats in that election. And most of the time he was winning 60. He didn't speak French at all, really. He let Ernest Lapointe was a sort of French-Canadian lieutenant, and later Louis Saint Laurent, who became the prime minister after him. But he started by being able to count on those seats. So if you get 60 out of 65 seats, you don't need that many more seats in Ontario, and he was always winning half of those. So that's the election right there. It's not surprising, even if he was in a minority position a few times. And he just knew that he wasn't going to alienate Quebec. And he made sure that he didn't, even when issues came up. He took some positions that we look at as very critical. One of them was not going against letting in German Jewish refugees during the 1930s when people told him to do so, and he refused to do so because Quebec just was opposed to letting any more Jewish immigrants in, no matter what the problem was. And so King knew that in his diary. There's a very telling entry about that someday history will remember this decision, and sure enough they have. And he doesn't look very good about it, but he did what was politically expedient. I guess lots of, as you know, lots of prime ministers do take that. It's just that we don't have Pierre Trudeau's diary or Justin Trudeau's diary or anybody else's for that matter.
Who knows what we'd see in those?
Exactly. So that we know what King was thinking about almost everything.
He always had high hopes for himself as a young man.
Yes.
Whichever route that might take. You mentioned you wrote about one of the episodes in his earlier part of his career, which seemed to be a pretty large factor in his eventual arrival in government, and that was in his involvement with John D. Rockefeller Jr. Can you describe that?
Right. Well, King was smart, and when he decided to get a job in Ottawa in the early 1900s, after he got involved in labor. At the time, capitalism was basically managers decide, and there were many problems because workers were caught in a situation where they were not getting a living wage, and this led ultimately to the development of unions and demands for compulsory arbitration and so forth. And governments decided that they needed to be like a referee or an umpire, or supposedly impartial, but really not always. And there were also issues that a lot of the workers in Canada, where they were British Irish, but a lot of immigrants also in certain areas. King sort of developed an interest in this and started working for the Labor Department. And he actually became the first deputy minister of labor at a very young age. So he developed, I guess, a particular expertise in the area of trying to negotiate. But he tended, I would say, to be a little more sided with management. I don't think he approved of unions all that much, or certainly didn't see, the value of compulsory arbitration. But he had sort of a Christian humanitarian approach to this, and he did believe that things should be fair. So eventually, he gets into politics, and when he is defeated in he actually becomes an MP year early, around 1908, I think, 1909 maybe, but then is defeated in 1911 election because the Liberals and Laurier lost over free trade. And he was a bit lost for a little while after that. But because he had done a lot of writing on unions and labor and had investigated strikes, John D. Rockefeller John D. Rockefeller Jr., the heir to the company of his father, which was a massive industrial factories and had mining interests and so forth, was having mining problems in Colorado. And they were looking they were trying to figure out how to best sell it. They had a PR guy, like an early version of a public relations person, because that was also rather new. And they were looking for some kind of labor person. And someone at Harvard who knew King, because he had been a student there and knew about King's work in Ottawa, suggested that Rockefeller contact King. So, he became essentially one of the first labor consultants. Rockefeller didn't make him move to New York, and he could stay in Ottawa, and he went back and forth. And, King, he paid him an amazing salary for that period of time. King wasn't able, he was too old to fight in the war. So this was going on during World War I. America hadn't entered the war yet. And King was trying to help Rockefeller settle, his image as well as deal with miners. So they went down to Colorado, and he got John Rockefeller to put on miner clothes and go into the mines. And there's great pictures.
Yeah, that was a funny photo, wasn't it? With
King. Well, it was perceived at the time to be brilliant. This kind of brilliant manipulation to make John Rockefeller the friend of the workers, and it worked. Even though, and then King spent years, the first or several years at least, writing this book called Industry and Humanity, where he tried to set out his theories. But it's a terrible book, and as I said, if anybody other than King had written it, no one would have ever read it. Rockefeller and his friends thought it was a bit nutty, but the book did well because, of course, by then King was a liberal leader, at least when it came out, I guess, and it sort of set him on his way. He was very proud. He'd be quoting the book 40 years later and talking about it with journalists and things, and thought that he had come to some sort of great theories about how to do it, how to work with people. And some of his theories aren't bad, right? People have to get along at work. Cooperation works. That was one of his theories.
But as you pointed out, you could sort of sense the liberal reform philosophy that he was developing at that time, and which said the state has an obligation to take care of its citizens. And he to some extent, he articulated that in his book. Would you consider that as a sign, which, as you suggested, that he was actually ahead of his time as far as developing modern day Canadian liberalism?
Maybe slightly, but the thing is, he took forever to do anything about it. The welfare state in Canada, but in the 1920s, the people pushing for things like old age pensions were labor MPs like J.S. Wordsworth, who was a Winnipeg preacher, got arrested during the Winnipeg strike, in fact. So King, waited till the last years of his prime ministership and after World War II to do anything about the old family allowances and old age pensions and pushing. So, he was always wanted to do it, But again, I think he sensed that his party and caucus were against him, and he had other thing. There were other things going on in the world, of course. So he was very slow. But I suppose I do give him some credit in that, with a lot of help from other people. But it took him a long time. If he had a plan in 1920, he didn't do anything about it for a good 25 years.
25 years. Well, and so he also played a large part in the evolution, I guess you could say, of the Canadian and British relationship. And some of this evolution developed through the Second World War, but also in the 1920s and 30s.
Right.
So how did King, and I guess his assistants as well, you have to give them credit. How did they contribute to that?
Yeah, he was very influenced by a professor at Queen's University, Oscar Skelton.
Mm-hmm.
I think, years later, King was accused of, making Canada closer to the United States, but it's not really true. I mean, any prime minister would have. It was just inevitable as the U.S. became more successful. So I think King and other Commonwealths, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, they all wanted more autonomy. So King accepted that kind of autonomous. He did not want, even though, I mean, when it came right down to it, when Canada entered World War I, Laurier's famous line is "Ready, I ready." We're here to help the mother country. When Britain entered World War II, Canada entered World War II primarily, in fact, only because Britain entered World War II. It had nothing to do. But even after there had been some autonomy granted and Statute of Westminster passed in 1931, stop Britain couldn't veto Canadian foreign policy any longer. So King was, although he wasn't prime minister at the time, he had laid the groundwork in the 20s at two conferences. But he was very, as I said, cautious. But he did push it in that direction. He didn't think governor general should be able to, as you know, he had a famous fight in the 1926 with Byng, or Governor General Byng, over a dissolution of Parliament, and King was again extremely manipulative in that, but won. And after that, governor generals really, especially the ones appointed by Britain, because the Canadians didn't start until Vincent Massey in the early 1950s. Governor generals couldn't really tell Canadian prime ministers what to do. The British were very paternalistic. Churchill, who was already in power, and other prime ministers, they just wanted all the Commonwealth countries that are colonies to salute smartly and do what they're told. And there was pushback. And so King was involved in that, and the people around him, and he was smart enough to listen. He was always very smart enough to surround himself with very intelligent people. You would think someone insecure and would not do that, but actually he listened to a lot of these people. And even John W. Defoe was the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press at a time when the paper commanded respect across Canada. Well, so listen, I didn't say that because I write for it. But he was a bigger deal. I mean, in those days, newspaper journalists were, I think, bigger than they are today for a variety of reasons. But Defoe was a big guy, and he even came to respect King and supported him more or less, not without reservations. But he wasn't with him on one trip to England, and King did impress him. So even a guy like that could be impressed. I think there was something to it. But I know King. There was always a tug of war going on, because some of his advisors, like Skelton, were a little less. They wanted to push away from the British, and King, I think, innately understood that if Britain went to war with Nazi Germany in 1939, that Canada had to be there right away. Even though King didn't want a war, he as you know, there's a famous meeting between King and Hitler in Berlin in 1937. It's not for believing. One of the great moments in King's life. And he was charmed by Hitler, and his writings afterwards are just completely crazy. But maybe not. I mean, he found Hitler charismatic and described his skin as being soft and things like that, which is kind of weird, but
it's
of
a
course
little creepy.
It is. Of course, we know what happened after King didn't, even though there was violence already going on, and Nazis were certainly not pleasant. But it's hard. You have to judge it that slightly differently, I think. And so King, King knew that but he didn't. He also knew that you couldn't force people to fight in the war if you had. He knew that conscription tore Canada apart in World War I, and he really did everything in his power to prevent it. And he never did have full-scale conscription in World War II. And even though it led to a resignation of one of his cabinet ministers, Colonel James Ralston, in a huge, bitter public fight that nearly tore the country apart, and a cabinet revolt, but somehow he survived it. And most of the people he had conscription for home defense only, and most of them, I don't think any of them ended up in Europe. Maybe a very small number.
Speaking of the war, there's been a lot of discussion about King's relationships with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and he has been given a lot of credit for being a mediator, I guess you'd say, between those two, and he has even been accepted, by some journalists as a close personal friend by both leaders. What do you feel
I
was
would
the
say
true nature
I would
of that
say a
relationship?
friend, but certainly not an influential mediator. That's just not true. Roosevelt and Churchill. First of all, Churchill needed King before the Americans entered World War II. They needed King because they were, two meetings in Quebec, and Canada also helped facilitate the transfer of American goods through Canada to Britain because of American laws of when under the Neutrality Acts before the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. King didn't like Churchill initially, like many people, but he came to respect him greatly. And Roosevelt, he certainly had great admiration for, even but initially didn't think much of the New Deal in the 30s. Thought Roosevelt was a little too left wing, and then of course when he met him, Roosevelt was charming, as we know, and King came. King just, again, his ego needed to be stroked, and Churchill and Roosevelt understood that and stroked it mightily. So just inviting King to have a drink, King didn't drink, or most of the time, but just sitting down with them and being kept in the loop sometimes. He didn't, King was not consulted on D-Day, let's put it that way. I mean, Roosevelt and Churchill ran the thing. King was there. I mean, C.P. Stacey writes cruelly that, at the one of the Quebec conferences, King was there to provide the scotch and soda while King and Roosevelt were talking. He's sort of like a host, and it was always tricky because they knew that King could be very mad if you insulted him. So they gave him enough that it kept him happy and him feeling important. But honestly, I don't think the important decisions were he did not participate in that, nor was he consulted. I know there's a new book talking about, it's more that we can get an insight into the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship because King left a good record of his perception of it. So, that, I guess, historically is significant. But certainly he's not the third partner in deciding what was going on in the war. That's just not, I would not subscribe to that.
Mm-hmm. Going back to his personal life, after he died, most of us would not be really aware of just how wealthy he managed to become during his life. He built up all of this huge land holding at Kingsmere, his home in Gatineau, and then his will reported in, I guess, an unexpected amount of money in his name. Would you say that he was an astute businessman, or where did that money come from?
He was
his close friends were wondering.
Yeah, he was very thrifty. The famous line is he never had money on him, and he always made sure shoelaces were used till they were down to a tiny amount. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, he inherited money. For one thing, some politicians left him money. I think running Laurier House was expensive, but I wrote about this a while ago, maybe a year ago. But there was secret funds set up by liberal. This would not go over well today, but going back to MacDonald, even Laurier, party supporters would set up secret funds for prime ministers to use as for their personal expenses. And King had a rather enormous fund set up at a bank in Boston. So that was always there. And he was later he became a bit paranoid that news about it would get out for obvious reasons. And he did become embroiled in a bit of a thing in the 30s when he was perceived to be doing something he shouldn't have done. But he came out scot-free, and a senator was made the scapegoat for the whole story. So he had that money, and then he had kept his money and some property. He developed Kingsmere, as you said, and which he loved. And he ended up giving Joan and her husband had a sort of there's about 3 cottages on there eventually, and so they had one. And you can go there today. It's a historical site, and I've been there. This is all, you can see where King lived, and he would go out there. He started going out there when he was very young, and then he acquired property. And he tried to be a farmer for a little while, buying sheep. That was a complete disaster. That didn't work out. And he also, of course, had these crazy gardens where he would go around buying all this strange archaeological stuff and set up. I don't know what it was. So it was sort of like a spiritual place of spiritualism. He buried his dogs there, and there's little gravestones. Poor Pat One, the poor dog. It's painful. In the diary, there's pages and pages of poor Pat. Today they put dogs down. In those days, I didn't know this, but in the old days, they used to electrocute dogs before they had needles and stuff. It was terrible. But so King didn't want to do that. And poor Pat just lingers. He had actually Joan and her husband had given, they both got puppies at the same time. So the Joan and got her husband's dog was Pat's brother, and the poor dog just lingers and eventually dies, and then it soon gets another dog. Then he calls him Pat 2. So Pat 3 outlived him, but I don't know what happened to Pat. One time one of the dogs ran away. It was like, whoa, that was bad. And somebody who worked for him let the dog run away, and then they finally found him. And King was certainly beside himself. He was out of town at the time. He was not happy. I don't know if he fired the guy, but probably did. And so he taught those dogs were his children. So that was part of his Kingsmere life too. He would do sort of nutty thing. Famous story. King was typically, for his day, anti-Semitic in a way that many Canadians were. But one time he had heard that some Jewish people were trying to buy some property close to Kingsmere. And he writes in his diary that he's going to go out there. He goes out there and buys the property before they can get a hold of it. It's just such a loony story. But that was typical. That was typical of the way he talked about that. And as I said, there's all these derogatory statements about Black people that would make you cringe. Asian people, his attitudes were terrible. I mean, the most famous is when the Americans dropped the bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. King writes in his diary the day he heard about it. That Truman didn't tell King or anything, but he writes that it's a terrible destruction and it's violent and war is violent. But if they had to drop a bomb, it's a good thing it's not on white people, and it's okay if they dropped them on Japanese. And this is the Prime Minister of Canada writing his private. And I assure you, as I put in the book when I talk about this, he wasn't the only white Canadian to think this way. I mean, that's just, as I said, the way people thought about these things, and the way in which the world in which we lived, or they lived. We just don't appreciate just how much the world has changed today, or maybe it hasn't, but at least we call attention to these things more than those days. I mean, no one really complained. When they locked the Japanese up during World War II, King had no qualms about it, maybe a little bit. And most of the people around him had thought he was doing the right thing. And even if they were expropriating property for people born in Canada, they were considered to be enemies. I remember years ago, I interviewed Jack Pickersgill, who was later a cabinet minister, but at the time worked for King, and he couldn't stand King. And he was already an old guy by the time I met him in about 89, 90. he told me that he never thought the king had done anything wrong with the Japanese internment, that no one should apologize. I think it was around the time that maybe Brian Mulroney had apologized for it initially, or soon thereafter. Maybe it was just after, and he didn't think that we owed them any apology. But that's how they saw the world.
Well, and to conclude here, Allan, despite all the foibles and eccentricities, you and many others have suggested that King's generally regarded as our greatest prime minister. What do you feel are the pros and cons for that?
Well, I don't know if I'd say the greatest. I know the last part of the book, I sort of consider that. He was certainly, I would say, is he a great man? Not by the standards how I think I would consider a great historical figure. But he was certainly very influential and important, significant in Canadian history. But I wouldn't say that he had the qualities. As I said, longevity counts. So you can't discount someone who was prime minister for 22 years almost, and in which time Canada changed so much. So King, the years between 1900 and 1950 are obviously Canada went through an amazing industrial, economic, and technological revolution, and King was always in the middle of that. So by that standard, he has to be considered one of the most important prime ministers, and significant, but great. I don't, that's always undergoing. MacDonald used to be considered great, and look at what's happening with his reputation because of his policies towards Indigenous people. I guess
you have to define what great.
Exactly. But whenever lists are made of Canadian prime ministers, King will be in the top three for as long as I can't see that he'll ever be replaced. There's whatever people think of MacDonald, he'll always be up there. So will Laurier, so will King. After that, there's everybody else. Then it's a bit of a who knows. Depends how things go. But I can't see anybody that's been since replacing any of those three. As in terms of, then the list can, as historians rank these things and whatever they're worth, right? They do fluctuate a bit. It's like, Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt in the United States. I can't see anybody ever replacing those three in terms of the greatness of presidents.
Well, Allan, I really thank you very much for taking time out today and for helping us to dissect the personality of this very important, I won't use great, of this important man in Canadian history. Thanks very much for being
here today,
pleasure, Allan. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
And I thank all of you for tuning in today. And remember, log on to outrageoushistory.com to find out additional information about this topic and others, along with information about the authors. For Outrageous History, I'm Ernest Granson. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.